It is the most flown and most reliable spacecraft in human history, safely bringing crews into orbit for over half a century. This is the Soyuz. Over its last 45 years of operation, it has not had a fatal incident. However, this safety record overshadows the tragic first years of the Soyuz, which were plagued with poor management and unrealistic deadlines. The Soviets' response to the issues raised by the Soyuz represents how even a crippling tragedy can feel a modern-day triumph. In 1945, World War II concluded, marking the beginning of a new era of tense political hostility between the United States and the Soviet Union, dubbed the Cold War. Soon space would become another arena for this global competition, as each side sought to prove their technological superiority. The space race officially began in 1957, when the Soviets launched the Sputnik into orbit, sparking fear in the American public.
As soon as the Sputnik moment happened in 1957, we were kind of, rattled a little bit as a country. The Soviets put something above us that's circling every 90 minutes.
Americans became even more rattled when, in 1961, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first man to go to space. In response, President John F. Kennedy challenged NASA to go further.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
Around the same time, the Soviets also began shifting the focus of their space program to the moon. Soviet engineers quickly realized that a journey to the moon would require a mid-space rendezvous. However, previous Soviet spacecrafts were not capable of performing this maneuver, so in late 1961, the Soviets began work on a new class of spacecraft, the Soyuz. The first Soyuz mission was set to be a test of the mid-space rendezvous systems on two Soyuz spacecraft, the Soyuz 1 and Soyuz 2. By the beginning of 1967, both NASA's Apollo and the Soyuz were nearing completion. However, the catastrophic failure of Apollo 1 during testing in February opened a path to success for the Soviets. In order to capitalize on this, the launch dates of the Soyuz 1 and 2 were set for April 23rd and 24th of 1967. This would also coincide with the 97th birthday of Soviet founder Vladimir Lenin, as well as the 50th anniversary of the Bolshevik Communist Revolution. 40-year-old Vladimir Komarov was appointed as the sole pilot of Soyuz 1, while his close friend Yuri Gagarin was appointed as the backup. Alexei Alisev, Valery Bykovsky, and Evgeny Krunov were to serve as the crew for Soyuz 2. As the date grew nearer, Soviet engineers realized they had an unfinished product and wrote a 10-page memo which listed 203 errors that the spacecraft had. However, Russian superiors would not postpone the launch. It was not until 2 months before the intended launch date, in February, that testing of the capsules began. Although engineers called for more training and testing, the tantalizing notion of beating the Americans kept Soviet premiers eager to launch. 2 hours before the scheduled launch time, Vladimir Komarov and Yuri Gagarin met on the launch pad to say their final goodbye. With a stroke of luck, the launch went without incident. However, when the spacecraft began to orbit, problems arose.
It has two solar panels, and one of them didn't open, so it wasn't generating as much electricity as it really needed, so there were power shortages and so on.
The blocked solar panel rendered the spacecraft asymmetrical, and it was hard to control. The crew of the Soyuz 2 prepared to go repair the solar panel, but they were grounded by weather. The mission was finally canceled and Komarov was ordered to return from orbit. Due to the control issues the spacecraft had encountered, Komarov was forced to perform a near impossible manual rocket retrofire to get the craft back to an angle where it could safely re-enter. He succeeded, yet in a horrible twist of fate, his main parachute would not deploy, and his backup chute got tangled up in the main parachute. At 6:24 Moscow time, on the morning of April 24th, 1967, the Soyuz 1 smashed into a field near Orenburg, Kazakhstan, instantly killing Komarov. First responders to the crash described a scene of horror, as the spacecraft had been reduced to a pile of rubble just 70 centimeters high. Komarov's remains were badly charred and were flown to Moscow for his open casket funeral on April 26th. Komarov had requested for an open casket funeral before his launch, leading many to believe that he knew his craft was unsafe and wanted officials to realize the damage that they had done. The next day, an investigation was launched into the crash. Investigators concluded that the main causes of the crash were manufacturing errors fueled by a political agenda that prioritized efficiency over safety.
Soyuz 1 was launched when it wasn't really ready. There were things that should have been done that weren't done.
Unfortunately, when you're in a hurry and you're doing things you've never done before, and you're under pressures you've never seen before, that's when errors can happen.
It would take 18 months for the Soviets to implement new safety measures and a redesigned parachute system. The Soviet space program underwent a major transformation after this tragic setback, and nearly 2 years after the fateful Soyuz 1 incident, the Soyuz 4 and 5 finally docked in space. Meanwhile, the United States had made tremendous strides in their Apollo program, and in July of 1969, they had put an American on the moon, defeating the Soviets. After this historic Soviet defeat, pressure began to diminish between the two world powers as the primary directive of spaceflight shifted towards manned space stations. Over the following years, the safety record of the Soyuz improved as technical flaws were ironed out.
In this particular case, the Soyuz program benefited hugely from that really unfortunate but also really instructive failure that happened with the parachutes.
So they learned from it, and then subsequent missions have been successful, and they worked out the kinks, but it did take a tragedy to do that.
In 1975, the United States and the Soviet Union collaborated in the Apollo-Soyuz test project, where an Apollo spacecraft docked to a Soyuz for the first time, effectively ending the space race. Since the Apollo-Soyuz test project, the Soyuz has flown 122 times and has never had a fatal incident, making it the most successful spacecraft in human history.
It has been, let's call it the workhorse of the Soviets and now Russian space program. Having a continued string of spacecraft that one evolves from the other is really valuable because, as I said before, you learn from your failures.
After the retirement of the space shuttle in 2011, it has become crucial for transporting astronauts and cosmonauts to the International Space Station. The spacecraft has gradually developed a renowned reputation from engineers and astronauts alike.
I felt very safe flying on the Soyuz. The Russians produced the Soyuz spacecraft, and they've been producing them for many years.
On October 11, 2018, the reliable safety systems of the Soyuz were put to use for the first time in 35 years. An improperly connected booster flipped up and recontacted the rocket, sending it spiraling out of control. However, due to the now perfected safety systems of the Soyuz, the astronauts' capsule was jettisoned, and both of the astronauts survived unharmed.
You know, you can have malfunctions even with a really proven system. Just goes to show how hard this business is.
After determining the minor issue that caused the MS-10 incident, the Soyuz stayed on schedule. On December 3, 2018, the Soyuz MS-11 blasted off to the space station, maintaining that the spacecraft will be an integral part of manned spaceflight for years to come.
It was born out of the Cold War. It was because of geopolitical fighting, because countries were being competitors against each other and trying to outdo each other. And that's what the space race was, and it's a different time than we're in today. Today you're seeing countries cooperate.
The space race accelerated technological advancements for both the United States and the Soviet Union at a previously unprecedented rate.
You could argue that without the space race, neither the U.S. nor the Soviet Union, nor really any of the other spacefaring nations, would have made the progress they made.
Unfortunately, this intense rivalry also led to tragedies like the death of Vladimir Komarov, which destroyed hopes of a Soviet lunar landing. The death of Komarov also established a philosophy of safety over efficiency in Soviet leadership. The lessons learned from the Soyuz 1 tragedy led to a safer Soyuz capsule with a 45-year safety record. The recent launch abort mission of the Soyuz demonstrates this philosophy, as the safety of the crew was prioritized over the success of the mission. Although the Soyuz was initially created to rival the Americans, it is now America's only access to the International Space Station. The overwhelming success of the modern-day Soyuz represents how even a crippling tragedy can feel a modern-day triumph.